It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure for me to talk about any images associated with the west of Ireland, because for a very, very, very long time I've had a deep concern about how the West has been portrayed, particularly in the 20th century. So one of the things that I've been doing for a period of time has been trying to hunt down images of the West and see how accurately or inaccurately they're portrayed. And that resulted in publishing a little book last year, Images of the West of Ireland from 1800 to 2000, which is available in the gallery and on our website. It's online, partly just to nail down images of the West from the National Gallery's collection. Now, one of these days what I'm going to do is do a book on images of the West of Ireland from collections all around the country, and that will give an even better picture of how the West is portrayed. Why, you might ask, would one be even remotely interested in why the West is portrayed as distinct from wonderful Donegal or Kerry or Cork or many of the other beauty spots? Well, one of the reasons for this is because in the late 18th, early 19th century, the West, as you know much better than me, was very, very remote. It was very hard to get to the West, and to penetrate the Connemara, etc., was exceptionally hard. Most people who visited Ireland went to places like Killarney, which had been renowned for a long time, to Wicklow, and to various other places that were relatively easy to get access to. But getting to the West was difficult. Getting to Galway was okay, but beyond that was exceptionally difficult. For the purposes of my little project, this book, I chose the West to be from Sligo down to Clare. This is, of course, there's loads of people to argue this. I've done other talks where I've gone from Donegal down to Kerry. But for the purposes of this little project, I had to pin it down, and I'd have liked to have included one or two works from southern Donegal, but unfortunately that county of Leitrim got in the way. So you can see it's really Sligo, Mayo, Galway and County Clare, and the majority of my works would be relating really to Mayo, Galway. What attracted people to the west of Ireland? Well, first of all, we're looking at an artist who painted in the late 18th century. In the late 18th century, there was a very small, exceptionally high quality group of landscape painters, the finest of whom is Thomas Roberts. Roberts came from Waterford. His father was an architect. He's very well known down there, but he is the finest of the late 18th century landscape painters. But James Arthur O'Connor would fit into that context. And he was first in Mayo in 1818 when Courtney Kenny invited him to paint his estate at Ballinrobe House. So these are the lakes near Ballinrobe, and this is the mill in Ballinrobe. And you can see the fine quality and attention that he's given to the painting. This is an early work by O'Connor. You can see just how early it is. O'Connor was only born in 1792. And you're looking at O'Connor's early style before he went to London, and with Francis Danby and George Petrie. And after that he began to travel, and he spent a fair amount of time in Europe, and his style completely changed, much influenced by Edmund Burke's theories of the sublime and the beautiful. And his later work is very dramatic. It's very, very dramatic. But personally, I prefer his early style, where it's relatively uninfluenced by anybody else except some of the early Dutch, French landscape paintings that he would have seen when he travelled around Ireland. So this is a very early work, 1818, and my talk today is going to focus on the period 1818 to 1916. And the date 1916 means nothing for this particular talk. In fact, one of the things that crossed my mind is the ideal way to give this talk is to do the 19th century, then to focus on the turn of the century, and then to focus on modernism in relation to the West. The person who was really critical to the west of Ireland in the early 19th century is this man. He was an archaeologist. He's known as the father of Irish archaeology. He was an antiquarian. He was a music collector. He was the finest topographical painter of the early 19th century. And he was a painter. George Petrie, who was born in Dublin, the son of a painter, had his finger in every single pie in Ireland in the early to the mid-19th century. He was involved in the Royal Hibernian Academy. He was one of their presidents for a while. He was on the council of the Royal Irish Academy. He was one of the founders of their museum. And the collections that he and others acquired for that museum ultimately were given to the National Museum, and they are the major antiquities that everybody goes to see. The Cross of Cong, the Ardagh Chalice, the Tara Brooch. They're all the antiquities that they collected in the Royal Irish Academy. He was involved in music collecting, and a very important music collector, and some of his work is in the Irish Traditional Music Archive. And he painted a whole series of views of Ireland that are very important records of what Ireland looked like at that time. And I have a particular interest in what Ireland looked like before the famine, because it was a much more highly populated country at the time, and so much changed in the wake of the famine. So this is a wonderful example of what Dún Aengus on Inishmore on the Aran Islands looked like in 1827. I mean, that's such a long time ago. And so that you understand how significant these rocks are, this cliff face is, overlooking the Atlantic. What Petrie has included is a boat off here, struggling in the waves, these tiny figures, which he silhouetted against this cloud face coming down, and then closer to you, two more. Again, standing, looking into the Atlantic, overwhelmed by the view. And this would have been a very common practice for view painters, was if you paint a view on its own, it doesn't mean anything. But when you show figures in the context of the view, it really gives it a human touch, but it also makes you realize how small and insignificant people were and the context of that period. This is the Chevaux de Frise that any of you who've been on Inishmore to see the Dún Aengus will know this very important Chevaux de Frise that relates back to so much of the buildings of these promontory forts in Brittany and in Iberia. Petrie travelled around the west of Ireland. He was known to be over here in the 1820s at a similar time to when Samuel Lover was over here. So this would have been in the very early stages of when you had some Irish writers, antiquarians, people who were starting to get interested in the history and heritage of Ireland, and were starting to go out and look for the history and look for the heritage. So much of their work, which was tied in with the Ordnance Survey, which was founded in 1824, the Geological Survey, which set out to map Ireland in 1845, and in the work of the Board of Public Works, which at that stage was draining lakes, which was draining rivers, which was trying to improve the structure of the country, and in the process unearthing a lot of antiquities, all of which went up to Dublin to the Royal Irish Academy. But there was a huge amount of work going on in the country at that time, and they would have been helping to open up routes. Following this, you have the likes of Bianconi and his carriages setting up. They would first have travelled from Dublin to Galway, and then finally, as you know, they had routes from Galway to Clifton and then from Mam Cross to Leenane. So this was the gradual process of opening up the west of Ireland, though of course, as we know, in the 1820s, the majority of travel at that time would have been by boat around the coastline. Most people would have travelled by boat, whether they were on short little trips or big trips, but all of the messages, if you like, things would have been transported that way all the time, because there were so many little harbours around the west, and the person who helped to create the piers in so many of these harbours was Alexander Nemo, who built all the piers all along the west of Ireland, and he is of course the grandfather of the little town of Roundstone, and the structure that he put on Roundstone then is the same structure that you find now. So these are all the ways that the West was gradually opening up and becoming a bit more accessible to visitors. The key thing in many ways was actually the establishment of the railway network. And the man who's synonymous with the National Gallery of Ireland, William Dorgan, was one of the key people who set up the railway network in Ireland. And the only bit of that railway that's of interest to you guys is of course the Great Western Midland Railway. And it went from Galway to Clifton, it went to Westport, it went all the way out to Achill. I mean, it's inconceivable now that there was a railway then. There was a railway that went up to Donegal, and my mother used to talk about how people used to tell her about the railways, and here we are in the incredibly advanced 21st century when there's only a few railways in Ireland. Back in the ancient 19th century, they'd railways going everywhere in Ireland. But anyway, the railway system was phenomenal because that really made it possible for people to travel. But back in the 1830s, 1820s, you have somebody like Petrie coming across Liscannor, County Clare, coming across a traditional habit, a custom, a tradition, and being smart enough and intelligent enough to know that this was worth recording. And he is one of a group of artists, of people, writers, people like John O'Donovan, Eugene O'Curry, something about their sense of Ireland at that time and the discovery of things made them aware that once they discovered them, they knew these were in the process of declining. A lot of the works that I'm showing you today were recorded by artists who, even at the time they were recording them, knew they were witnessing a lifestyle that was going to decline and disappear. So you're looking at a traditional series of stations that are taking place around this stone, which has a little cross on it. And what's interesting about the way Petrie has portrayed it, it's around as it often is, because this probably relates to earlier Celtic times, and in earlier Celtic times, so many of the sites were associated with water. He's paying attention to the customs, to the way the people are dressed. They're barefooted, they've got little brots, they've got cloaks across their shoulders. They used to wear little shawls across their head, which they'd tuck in here. They'd have another shawl across their shoulder, which they'd cross over and tuck in around their waists, and then they'd put on more. Not everybody had these great cloaks, because the cloaks were more often than not made by a travelling tailor. They cost money, but they were fantastic at protecting you, and they would have been handed down from generation to generation. The people who came to these traditional events, this would have been celebrated at the very end of July, the beginning of August, the Feast of Lunasa. They would have travelled from the Aran Islands, they would have come from Clare, and they would have come from South Galway to take part in this traditional station at Liscannor. Beside me here is a very fine painting, although Burton painted this landscape far better than Petrie, but very fine painting of the 12 Bens Connemara. And you all know that on a day 2 or 3 weeks ago, if you were driving through this countryside, that's exactly what it looked like. Exactly what it looked like. And this is Petrie again, but he's intelligent enough not to just show you the landscape. He's included the cows and the sheep and a figure, so immediately you feel you're part of it. You feel people did live here, people did work here. And that's why he's such an important artist. But I also wanted to make a point in the talk today of making you very aware of just once overseas artists started to travel to Ireland, just how many of them came to the west of Ireland. Now, William Evans wasn't the first of these. You have Cornelius Varley travelling to Killarney to do the Lakes of Killarney, because Killarney is a beauty spot going back, way, way back. He was coming back in the late 18th century. You have Frederick Robinson up in Antrim, and you have Mary Delaney painting in Wicklow and in other parts of Ireland. But Evans was one of the earliest to come to the west. He was based in Eton, and that's where he's most well known. In fact, he's known as William Evans of Eton. But he came to Galway and he followed a particular route up via Uachtarard, Mam, Leenane, up to Achill and down the coastline via Clifton, etc. And I ask you, what are we looking at now? We're virtually standing in it. The Spanish Arch in Claddagh, not a million miles away from what it was then. The best part of this painting is the Claddagh. How they ever took the Claddagh down, I do not know. It's a national scandal to this day. 400 to 500 people lived in the village of the Claddagh. They considered themselves a slightly superior race to the rest of the tribes in Galway. I was just reading about them the other day in Sterling and Coins, Antiquities of Ireland. Very, very interesting people. And of course we have the hookers here with the little puck on, or a glow choke, I'm not sure what. The wonderful gathering of the people coming in, because this is such a gathering place, there's a natural shelter there. And then we have over here Buttermilk Lane. Buttermilk Lane still exists, as you all well know. But what Evans, alike Sir David Wilkie and so many of the artists in the 19th century found so interesting about the west of Ireland, and there were other parts of Ireland, such as Waterford, you found this as well, where you had these narrow medieval lanes and archways, and where people very intelligently hung their washing up here higher up, because I've seen this in Waterford many years ago, and it was always almost as though you were in Naples. And then the colours of the women in their red petticoats, in their shawls. Remember what I mentioned about those little shawls over? These were smart ladies. The more layers you put on, the drier and the warmer you kept. So that's why they had them. The cloaks, another shawl, the red petticoats, coming in to sell their vegetables in the market, whatever. So Evans observed all of this with a slightly romantic eye. I mean, his work is accurate, slightly romantic. And he originally came in 1835, travelled around the West, put together a portfolio of paintings and brought them back to England. Now, the Royal Watercolour Society had been founded in 1805. You've already got the Royal Academy, you've got the Royal Scottish Academy, you've got the British Institution, and a whole host of provincial major exhibitions in England. And of course, one can't forget the fact that Ireland and England were united in the British Empire at that time. So you'd have had Evans going back to Eton to mount and frame all his watercolours and bring them down to the Watercolour Society, and every single one of them sold. They'd never seen this place before. And that's what was interesting about these watercolours, when people like Sir David Wilkie and Topham and Frith and Frederick Goodall, when they all started displaying these in London, this was something exotic. People were fascinated by these. And any artist immediately was saying, where is this? How do you get there? And that's always what artists are looking for, somewhere new, different, original. So the following year, Evans dug out his portfolio, touched up another series of watercolours, put them on display, and they all sold as well. As a result, in 1838, he returned and he did another tour of the west of Ireland. And these watercolours come from a portfolio that the gallery bought in 2008 or 9 from a descendant of Thomas Gambier Parry, who was a student of Evans. So these watercolours came in a portfolio that this student of Evans acquired from him and had been held in their family until we purchased them. So they are perfect. So this is William Evans of Eton. So Evans was over here in the West in 1835 and 38. And I asked myself, who did he meet on that trip? He must have met George Petrie. And Samuel Lover, I don't have any works of Lover included. We have works by Lover in the gallery, very important artist, not just because he was a painter, but he was a great musician, and he also wrote antiquity books, but ended up in London and made a very successful career in London. But Lover came over to the west of Ireland and he painted in Connemara, and he learned some of the music here, and I'd love to get some works. I mean, the Kelp Gatherers is an example of a work by Lover, but Lover knew Burton, and I bet he met up with William Evans of Eton. He knew Petrie as well. So the next artist I wanted to present to you is William Henry Bartlett. Joseph Sterling Coyne, along with Willis, published a book in 1840 based on trips around Ireland, and Bartlett did a whole series of drawings, out of which a series of plates were taken for the book. This book that I have taken a plate from was published in 1842. This time it was Sterling Coyne who did the trip around Ireland, and Bartlett illustrated all over Connemara, and it's wonderful to hear the comments. Now, I've only included one, and it's kind of an unusual view, and this is Delphi Lodge. And any of you who know Delphi and down in the Killeries, it's an extraordinary spot. It was Lord Sligo who owned Delphi Lodge, and it was very customary for any of the aristocrats or wealthy people who were touring the west of Ireland to call in and stay with Lord Sligo in Sligo and then to come on to Delphi Lodge. And my feeling is a lot of these artists must have heard about it, and I'd say were facilitated. Now, it was a hefty trip to come all the way over by boat to get here and then to climb up to the lodge. But as any of you who know that area well will know, that the views are extraordinary, quite extraordinary. And this is only a black and white plate. The artist who is very important to this period and is very important where the west of Ireland is concerned is one of our own. And it's Frederick William Burton, who comes from Corofin, County Clare, where they claim him very strongly and with full justification. Born in 1816, died in 1900, had several phases to his career. The family moved them at a very early age to Dublin. Burton, who's a left-handed painter in watercolour only, was trained at the Dublin Society schools, and we think probably was apprenticed to Samuel Lover, but his early training was in miniature painting, and he started out as a miniaturist. And it's from his early miniature painting that you get all this extraordinary refinement of detail. He exhibited first at the Royal Hibernian Academy at a very early age and was recognised immediately as being an artist of significance. The Aran Fisherman, as you can see, was painted in 1841, but let's just look at Paddy Keneally. I was just reading in Sterling's book last night a description of Paddy Keneally, and it was Petrie who discovered Keneally. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he was a well-known, very well-known Galway uilleann pipe player. And there were many at that time. Haverty painted the blind piper that we have in the National Gallery, and it was very common for musicians. Many of them were blind, and they developed very honourable careers travelling around the country, sometimes around their area, where they were well looked after, they were kept overnight, they were fed, and because they were very fine musicians. But I've heard about this guy that despite the fact that he was blind, he used to go to the races, he had extraordinary hearing, and it was as though he could see what was going on. Petrie came across him and recognised immediately that this was a musician who was playing music from another era and set about recording it. And he told Burton about him, and the reason Burton became interested in painting in the west of Ireland wouldn't have been an obvious thing for an artist who came from the gentry, if you like, and who'd gone to live in Dublin. It was Petrie spotted Burton, big, tall, elegant fellow, drawing in a gallery in Dublin. I often wonder what that gallery was, maybe the Royal Dublin Society's gallery. Saw him drawing and was taken by his manner and his commitment and started to talk to Burton. And then when he discovered Burton came from Corofin, he said, "You should be going to the west of Ireland. You should be studying the people of the west, your origins, your history, your heritage. You should be over there studying them." So he brought Burton over to the west of Ireland. And Burton seems to have travelled around Connemara, up as far as Achill, possibly following similar routes to Evans. He knew Robert Caldwell, and the Caldwells had a house, I must track it down, somewhere near Uachtarard or maybe further into Connemara. He certainly stayed with the Caldwells in Connemara. That's how these artists got around. That's how these guys who were well connected got around. They knew the families who had houses here in the west, and they stayed with them. And he certainly spent time in the Claddagh, it's definite. But Petrie alerted him to Paddy Keneally, so as a way to pay respect to Petrie, Burton did this watercolour for him. And this was engraved and printed in the Irish Penny Journal with a commentary by Petrie. So that's quite an important record of a very important musician. This is a very, very important painting, the Aran Fisherman's Drowned Child. Believe it or not, that is a watercolour. And Burton painted this watercolour, and he used to mount his watercolours in a very careful, particular way. He had the paper laid on boards, cut at corners, fitted on the back, very, very particular. And when the painting was finished, it was framed in these beautiful gold hand-carved frames with the instruction by him, which comes with his most famous painting, The Meeting on the Turret Stairs, supposed to be Ireland's favourite painting. But anyway, that painting came with the instructions: do not take my painting out of this frame, because the way it's been framed is to protect the colour. Why would he have been so fussy about protecting the colour? because it's watercolour. Watercolour fades once it's in the light. So it was very important to him that his paintings were protected. The Aran Fisherman's Drowned Child was painted in 1841, so why should that be an important painting? Because it's pre-famine. How many images have we got of the way the Irish people lived prior to the famine? Because the famine decimated so much of the country and people didn't paint it. The Irish didn't paint the famine. How could they? When your heart is broken, how can you paint something? But Burton painted this picture in 1841. Now, my theory is, while it's described as the Aran Fisherman's Drowned Child, and the original word he used was A-R-R-A-N, Aran, which is the older way of often describing the Aran Islands, I think, in fact, this is painted in the Claddagh of an Aran Islander who lived in the Claddagh with a woman, his wife. But I think I've spoken to so many people many years ago when I researched it. For example, Dick Scott is the great historian of the hookers, and he told me that if this was on any of the islands, particularly in Ishmore, you'd never have been close enough to a harbour to have hookers there, but you would have on the Claddagh. Also, talking to many historians about the cabin, the cottage that this is taking place in, it's bigger. It's better quality, it's got a higher roof, it's neat, it's tidy. What people lived like that? The Claddagh people. They were known for that. The women were known for being very house proud. The men were known to be extraordinary fishermen who went out on the seas, came back, handed over all the fish to the women. It's the women who sold the fish, and it's the women who kept the money and managed the house. So that there was a very interesting lifestyle in the Claddagh that's worthy of documenting, because they had their own chieftains, they had their own particular habits and customs. Just as here, when you look at the cabin itself, you can see the fish drying, the long line fishes for fishing out in the bay, the Bridget's Cross, the tradition of putting a Bridget's Cross every year in the roof of the cottage, marking a new year. The smoke hole, a little keep hole in the corner where they put things like salt and sugar to keep it dry. This particular style of a fire with the movable crane on which there's a pot with potatoes and probably a couple of onions, and a smoke hole in the roof, because this was before there were chimneys, through which the smoke would have disappeared up and given some light. The roof, and then you have the people sitting around. What's taking place here? What's the scene? Well, it's a normal scene. The women were sitting. She was knitting morcini. What are morcini? They are the toeless socks. Why were they toeless? Because they wore pampooties, and for your feet to grip the skin, the rawhide, to make the pampooties cling to your feet properly, you needed your toes to be bare. What they would do is they'd leave the pampooties outside the house. They'd dip them. They had these little, what we would probably call bird tables outside, stone little bird tables outside the cottage, that water would be there, and they'd dip their feet into the water, and that would soften the rawhide, and then off they'd go. So she was knitting morcini. The dog's an odd one now. I'm not going to tell you for a moment that he came from the west of Ireland. That Scotty little terrier, I don't know where he came from, but anyway, there's a dog there. She was knitting. The woman of the house, one of her children, the grandfather, another one of the children, probably neighbours, come in to chat. And the husband comes in and he lays on her lap the child that has drowned. How did the child drown? I researched a whole load of drownings of children in the Irish folklore department. I asked Aniel the Bourke about it, but I could never pin down anything. Why would you at this stage in Ireland's history to one drowning? But the child somehow drowned, and the father has come in. You can see he has his jacket, which was the habit apparently for so many of the jacket men. They put them over the shoulders, they didn't put their arms into them. He's got his waist jacket, he's got his bawnine jerkin, he's got his bawnine trousers dyed blue with indigo, and he's got a little red. Now, Burton's turning him into quite a romantic looking fellow, because this is the middle of the 19th century when Romanticism was sweeping Europe. So he has given a dramatic twist to a very poignant, real situation. You have this young boy has come in, he's got a tam o' shanter on his head. We're going to see that again. And what's going on here? Word has spread, and the official keeners are coming in. Beg she the queen. Once, very shortly, when things settle down, these women will begin the lamentation about this child. And then there's a whole process of traditions about how that child would be buried. What's this here? It's raw cowhide. What's this for? Making pampooties. That's probably what the old grandfather was doing. He, unlike the father, is wearing knee breeches, and he'd have a jerkin with the pleat at the back, and you can see it's patched. That was perfectly acceptable. Turned up collar, wearing his pampooties with long socks. The women are wearing absolutely correctly. They're wearing petticoats dyed red with madder, beaten so that they would be soft on one side, hard on the other side. The hard edge kept the water out. The water could beat around this, but it would fall off, and the inside it was soft. They had little jerkins, they'd have little tops on top of them, and then they had these shawls that I mentioned to you wrapped around and tucked in. You can't quite see it, on top of which they'd have aprons. They used to wear so many layers. She's got her little shawl over her head. She's got hers around her shoulder. And see what she's done, which is what they did a lot. She's wearing her apron on the front. When they sat down, they put the apron behind them. They used to wear their clothes in a completely different fashion. For example, often when they went into somewhere like the Spanish Arch and it was windy and wet, the women would go right up to the wall of the Spanish Arch. Remember, these are heavy, heavy skirts. And they would lift the skirt up and swing it over their head and go right back to protect themselves. The cloaks also, they used to wear them in different fashions. And the child, of course, like this little fellow, as all the children were in those days, up until nearly puberty, they would have been dressed, boys and girls alike, as little boys and girls, with the old picharogue that's so the fairies couldn't tell the boys from the girls. But that was a common practice all over Europe. And a lot of these, in different versions, you'll find different patterns of this style of dressing elsewhere in Europe. But what really caught the eye of people like Evans and Wilkie and Burton is the colour. You see them writing about, and the costumes of the women were like a Giorgione, a Rubens, a Titian. They're liking them to Venetian painters because the colour was so striking against the landscape of the west of Ireland. And Burton got all of that. I'm not going to dwell on Burton, but he is a very important painter for the west of Ireland until he leaves and goes elsewhere. A bunch of artists from overseas very shortly afterwards, in the 40s, 1840s, came to Ireland. You've Fripp. Fripp came with Antony, and then a year or two later in 43 he came back again with Goodall and Topham, and they went all over the west of Ireland, spent a lot more time, would have been studying the lifestyle of the people, began to become more aware of the fact that this was less a picturesque lifestyle and more a very hard one. These people suffered a lot of hardship. This is Alfred Downing Fripp. It was he who came over with Mark Antony and then came back a year or two later with Frederick Topham, Goodall, and himself again. This is in a Connemara cabin, as you can see, and it was painted in 1845. So we are now on the edge of the famine. And what's interesting about this interior of a cabin, it's somewhere in Connemara. It's a good quality cabin. How do we know that? It's got quite a high roof. It's got all the long line fishing lines up here. It's got a hearth, a proper hearth, and it's got one of the key denoting factors of a good quality cabin, a dresser, with some china on it and other details around the cabin. What's important about this painting is, number one, we've somebody standing outside the door there, a bit dejected looking. We've got an empty bowl, we've got a quichon in which the potatoes, when they were cooked, would have been put in and you would have all eaten from them. We've got a hearth, but we've no fire. And we've got a mother here with a little child sitting there. She's sewing. There's a sense of early desolation about this. There's no food in the house. Whether it's quite the famine or not, but there is a definite sense of bleakness about this work. This is an artist from Scotland who, believe it or not, Erskine Nicol has painted a lot of Ireland. He came over to Ireland in the early 50s and he built a lodge in County Meath, Clonmeath Lodge, which is where he lived, and he used to come over to Ireland regularly. But it was in the 50s that he came over to paint Connemara, probably because, having gone back to exhibit at the Royal Scottish Academy and in London, he came across images of Connemara, or he heard about it from some of the artists, and he decided to go over here and paint. Now, this isn't stated that these are from Connemara, but it's my feeling that they are. He took them somewhere in Galway. We have the people in the very standard traditional costume. He's smartly picked out the indigo blue jerkin, under which he's got a red waist jacket and the white Lena shirt. And here we have the chap wearing, not a million miles away from the one we saw on the Burton, the blue jacket with the little brass buttons and the tam o' shanter hat with a little thing around the edge, the white Lena underneath, and the Bawneen jerkins. A young lad, rough, perhaps he's from the ships because Galway was such a busy port at that time, but very accurate, realistic studies. And there are mixed views about Nicol. There are a lot of people who view him as having satirised the Irish. We've two paintings in the gallery, the eviction scene and St. Patrick's Day. Certainly in the St. Patrick's Day painting, they're all dancing and drinking and flying around the place like there's no tomorrow, but that was the custom of the time. And the eviction scene is quite an accurate one. It dates to 1853. So my feeling is that Nicol had a very sympathetic eye about him. If he saw a scene that deserved to be characterised, he didn't. But most of his studies are like these. They are very sensitive ones. And he exhibited them all in Scotland and in London. Now this fellow, on the other hand, a Belfast born, was very interested in the scenery. He travelled around the west of Ireland, particularly in the 1870s, for 15 years, and he had a particular interest in the mountain ranges. So you can see here exactly, we're back in Killary Harbour. You're looking out from Leenane, and he was interested in, aside from the mountain ranges, he was interested in the lifestyle of the people. So what you're actually looking at here is all the men getting their fish nets onto the boats before they set off to fish for herring. This was a particular herring fleet. So it's a very interesting view. You can see the purple tonality that he's given the mountains. Now, Augustus Burke, interestingly enough, came from the west. He was actually born in Tuam. But educated in England and on the continent, he spent a period of time in Brittany. And we have a number of his works from Brittany. He's very much associated with that group of Irish artists who painted in Brittany. Who would I be talking about? Lavery, Leach, Osborne, Nathaniel Hill, Nathaniel Home, wonderful paintings. So he came back and he was over painting in the West for a period. Ultimately, he went back to Dublin, where his brother was the Lord Lieutenant, and he was murdered in the Phoenix Park, and the family left and he ended up in Italy. But this was painted in Connemara, a part of the country he must have had a natural sympathy for. We can see two goats who are rambling round. It's curious because you see goats in the West, not hugely frequently, but you do see them. They're very important now for both their milk and their cheese. But he's trying to show what you'd call the highlands, the rough hills of Connemara, and the girl who's gathering ferns, interestingly enough. And ferns would have been collected in those days because they would have been used in the cabins to lie on, and there are other uses for them that just at the top of my head have slipped my mind. The girl would have been studied possibly from a local girl, but she is a studio painting. He would have completed her in the studio, which is why she's so clean and neat and tidy. She's wearing a petticoat, all right. She's got her shawl. She's a little bit clean and neat and tidy for somebody who's standing out in the hills. But that's the academic tradition coming through. But still a record at this particular period of time. We're moving up towards the end of the century, and I wanted just to include Nathaniel Hone, because the Hone family are a great family of painters. There's Nathaniel Hone the Elder, who was a very early painter, one of the founders of the Royal Academy in London. He had a flock of children, one or two of whom were miniature painters, and this is an ancestor of his Nathaniel Owen, who went off to paint in Barbizon, south of Brittany, near the forest of Fontainebleau. And he was one of the artists who, in the mid-19th century, studied with the French landscape painters and brought this far more natural tradition of landscape painting back to Ireland. He only ever had one job very briefly in his life, and that was working on the Great Western Midland Railway. And that's, I reckon, how he got himself down to paint in the Cliffs of Moher in County Clare. He's done wonderful painting of Kilkee. Around Kilkee he did some lovely paintings. He did what all artists ought to do. He lived in North County Dublin, and he married one of the Jemison family. So he was wealthy for the rest of his life, because they're, of course, the great whisky people. But this is one of his depictions of the West, of the Cliffs of Moher. Now, this artist, for a long time people didn't realise this very important artist painted in the West. Osborne is such an important painter. Walter Osborne, a lovely, lovely man. He was just a person who had, very seldom do you know of an artist who can paint with a human touch. It doesn't matter whether he's painting a landscape or animals or children or people, he always paints them with a great deal of humanity. Orpen, who I'm not including in our talk today, was an incredibly skilled painter, an incredible draftsman. What he lacked was Osborne's sense of humanity. But Osborne did travel around the west of Ireland between 1893 and 1899, which I find particularly interesting, because the other people who were over in the west at that time were Jack Butler Yeats and John Millington Synge. They wouldn't have been obvious bedfellows, if you'll excuse the expression, but one is always asking myself, who knew about who? Who knew about the movements of people at that time? What we have, I know it's a very dark painting and it doesn't compare to some of the others, but Osborne was painting a very dark scene. Why? Because we know that these little cottages that so many people lived in, they might have had one little window and the front door, and that's where the light came from. And when it was night time, they lit candles. So what you're seeing here is an accurate reflection of a scene where the front door is wide open, casting brilliant sunshine on the flagstones, and everybody else is in the background, and it's not easy to see. Years later, Orpen would repeat this scene. There's a very, very famous painting by Orpen, Old John's Cottage. If you've never seen it, dig it out and try and look at it online. And Sean Keating did a similar view of this, the old people around the fire. But this is a very early view where you have the very unclear outline of the husband. Well, is he the husband? He's an older man and he's over tending to the fire. And here we have the woman of the house. She's doing something with her hands. There's some sort of box thing here, and they are absolutely in their traditional places on either side of the fire. The cabin is muddy brown because the peat fires, the turf fires, over the years would have smoked the inside of the cabin to that colour. There's an emptiness about the house. So if any of you do know Orpen's Old John's Cottage, you'll know that that particular painting celebrates or marks an American wake. The reason the old couple are sitting on either side of the fireplace is because a great party is taking place elsewhere to mark the departure of their children to America. This scene, I suspect, has an emptiness about it because the children are long gone. And there's a sense of they're just left there on their own now. It's not a tragic scene as much as a very realistic one. This is the way it is. They eke out a perfectly honourable, basic lifestyle, but it's lonely. When your children are elsewhere, it's lonely. I put in Harry Clarke. Harry Clarke is a stained glass artist. Most people don't think about him in association with the west of Ireland. Harry Clarke first went to the Aran Islands in 1909. He'd heard about them. And this is another incredibly tragic artist. Died very tragically in Switzerland of TB. Incredibly creative. A brilliant, brilliant genius. Brilliant artist, the son of a stained glass artist, Joshua Clarke. But he had heard about the west of Ireland. So he went there to see for himself what it was like. And we think that this is taken from Inisheer or Inishmean. I think it's Inisheer, and it's looking at Fanor. He went over several summers to the west, and it was he who told Sean Keating about the west of Ireland. And it's because of him that Keating started going, and in the main stayed on the Aran Islands, and as my father said, learnt a version of Irish that he thought was Irish, but he thought it was Aran Island Irish, but Dad said it wasn't that easy to understand. We're coming towards the end of our talk now because I really wanted to try and keep it in the 19th century rather than the 20th century. So we're just going to look at these few early works before we hit into the whole cusp of the Celtic revival, where you have the lead towards the Easter Rising and the Troubled period, and the paintings that create a sense of identity for the new state. We're not getting into that. I just wanted to keep it firmly here. We're coming towards the end now. I bet this is an artist you've never heard of before. Frances Trench. She was born in Liverpool of Irish parents. And she became like a lot of people who are not born in Ireland, but from Irish ancestors. She became more Irish than the Irish themselves. She was educated in Europe, and as a very young woman came to Ireland and over to the West. She learnt Irish on Achill and met up with this chappie, another overseas person, Claude Chavas. He, I think, was Oxford educated, and when he came to the west of Ireland, he too learnt